This morning, the big oil sands companies in Alberta announced the Oil Sands Pathway to Net Zero initiative. And they basically want to get there by 2050. We've already seen a big announcement from Suncor last week. But now, here come all the other companies. So we're going to talk to Keith Stewart from Greenpeace about that. Welcome to the interview, Keith.
Thanks for having me.
So, what's your general response to this announcement?
So the oil companies recognize they have a problem. They recognize that net zero is now a minimum expectation from investors, increasingly from governments. We saw a groundbreaking report from the International Energy Agency, which has traditionally been very pro-oil, saying we actually have to stop using fossil fuels. And so I think they're trying to get ahead of the game to trying to define what net zero means. And interestingly for them, net zero is all about their emissions, not about the emissions from their product, which doesn't work because you're talking 85% of emissions come from burning the oil in tailpipes and homes and etc. So I think it's interesting they've gone there, particularly seeing Imperial Oil, which is a branch of Exxon, sort of starting to talk about net zero. But we have to look at the full value chain and recognize that they need to change their business model, not just public relations and hoping a little bit of carbon capture will get them out of this mess.
Well, let's talk about that business model, because one of the things I found very interesting in here, they're talking about a wide variety of technologies to get to net zero, but they also mentioned carbon capture. Now, I recently wrote an article in Alberta Views magazine in which I argued that the oil sands companies should prepare for a post-combustion future where we're not burning oil anymore, just to your point about tailpipe emissions. And one of the options is to use bitumen as feedstock for materials production, like carbon fiber. And they specifically mentioned that. And so is it Greenpeace's position that if the industry were able to transition to feedstock for materials instead of feedstock for fuel, would that change your take on the oil sands?
Yeah, so that would definitely be part of it. Like carbon capture has a role, but a very limited role relative to what a lot of the conventional energy players say in a low carbon future. Because when you look at the sort of oil, gas, and coal companies, they're basically looking at carbon capture as a way to sort of reduce their own emissions at source. But you can't put carbon capture on the end of a tailpipe. You can't put it on the gas exhaust from your house. So this is where we need to actually stop burning fossil fuels, like you say. So if you want to use carbon capture as part of industrial processes so that there actually is sort of no emissions, that can be part of a green future. But a lot of times it's simply being used as cover for business as usual, to sort of say, okay, we're gonna, in the same way that in the 80s, we put scrubbers on smokestacks of the Inco plant and the refineries to deal with acid rain. We're gonna do that. Well, actually we need to change these companies from being oil and gas companies to being renewable energy companies. And that's, I think, where, when you read that announcement, they're not there yet. They're not even close. They're very much about, we're going to be selling oil and we're just going to change the way we produce it.
Well, that raises an interesting question, Keith, because we saw only a few weeks ago, Tim McMillan, who's the CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, arguing the company line, which was, maybe we'll call it the party line instead of the company line, because the company line appears to have changed now, but arguing that you could raise emissions, you could lower emissions long-term while raising production. Suncor says they're not going to do that. And that seems to get to your point, is that the industry has to change, but not all of the industry is on board yet.
Yeah, it was really interesting that this announcement came from the 5 companies and not from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. I think there's real divisions within CAP as to, how they are going to address sort of net zero world. And definitely, I think some of the smaller players are, really not there. They just want to keep doing what they're doing. The bigger players, I mean, they can't ignore this because their investors won't let them. I mean, when you look at the coup that happened at the Exxon annual general meeting last month, where this tiny little hedge fund said, you guys aren't taking climate change seriously, that's bad for business. And they won 3 seats on the board of directors. Like, that is unprecedented. And that's like basically an investor revolt, not just from that little, tiny firm, but it was backed by some of the biggest names saying, you got to start taking this seriously. And this is not a public relations problem. This is a business model problem. and start thinking about how you're going to change your business to not sell fossil fuels. And I think, some of the oil companies are definitely not there yet. And even when you look at their overall capital spending, even the ones who say they're there, the real money is still going into fossil fuels with a little bit on the side for renewables.
So I guess that's really the issue to be determined here, Keith, is this a business model pivot for the big oil sands companies who produce, frankly, most of the oil in Alberta and in Canada? Is it a business model pivot, or is it just a more sophisticated form of greenwashing? Your take.
So I'd say right now, this is still a much more sophisticated form of greenwashing. We've seen all of the individual companies coming out with these net zero announcements, very carefully excluding emissions from burning their product, very vague on how they're actually going to get there. In some ways, it's similar to what we saw back in 2012 with the announcement of COSIA on we're going to deal with tailings ponds. It's been 9 years, and they have regular press releases about how they have these research measures ongoing, but on the other hand, the tailings ponds are still getting bigger. So I think it is really interesting to see the oil companies recognize, kind of like, Houston, we have a problem. They aren't there at the real solution yet. And, that is going to be this transition to renewables. I read that press release as basically a PR initiative and a pitch for government funding. They were basically saying to the governments of Alberta and particularly the federal government, give us a lot of money and we'll reduce our emissions if you pay for it. And we really need our public dollars to go into that shift to a different type of energy system.
Keith, final question. The Allen inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns has been in the news lately, mainly because it's got its fourth extension and is being criticized, we'll say, very publicly. And of course, Greenpeace was part of the tar sands campaign, which was the centerpiece is the main target of that inquiry. So tell me, from your point of view, is the tar sands campaign, is this kind of what you were working for back in 2009 when it started, and up until recently when it became less active?
So I'll just start by noting the Allen inquiry has still never spoken to us. Our lawyer has sent them 3 letters, to which they have not replied. But, back, in 2009-ish, 8-ish, whenever this campaign was being launched, we said we wanted 3 things. We wanted to stop the expansion of the oil sands now. We wanted to reduce the harm from existing operations, so clean up existing operations, tailings ponds, reducing emissions, that kind of thing, as part of a plan to phase out production entirely, recognizing that's going to take decades. And so I think what we've seen is we've basically seen, expansion is largely stopped. There might be a few in situ projects, like additional projects that get it, but there's going to be no new mines. There's going to be no new major projects. Now it's going to be a fight over, I think the next little while is going to be a fight over that cleanup and phase out plan. Is it going to protect workers, communities, the environment? When you look at what happened to the coal industry when they started going down, it was the taxpayer that got stuck with the bills as the executives walked away with their golden parachutes. And you've got like leaking tailings ponds that are now left for somebody else to clean up. So I think we've seen that the end of the expansion era. Greenpeace has been calling for that, but right now it's like BlackRock and Vanguard and the major investors joining in that call. And the International Energy Agency. If you would have told me in 2009 the International Energy Agency would say, we need to stop building fossil fuel infrastructures, I would have told you were crazy. That's where we're at right now. It's that question of how are we going to phase this out? Who's going to cover those costs? Who's going to protect workers and communities as this happens? And how fast can we do it? Because if we as a country are serious about net zero by 2050 or sooner, that means we actually have to stop producing and using fossil fuels in relatively short order.
Keith, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.